I was only 19 when I first arrived in Harlow Creek, though the locals called it the Crossing back then, a place barely marked on the maps, hidden in a fold of pine-covered hills where the fog never seemed to lift. I had come to help my uncle with his sawmill, or at least that's the story I told strangers. The truth was, I needed to leave home, to put as much distance as I could between myself and the events that had unfolded the winter before. The first thing you noticed about Harlow Creek wasn't the smell of fresh-cut lumber or the sound of axes in the distance. It was the water. The creek ran dark, even in daylight, with a strange, oily sheen that caught the sun in colors you couldn't quite name. The locals drank from wells, never from the creek itself, though no one would say why outright. My uncle's mill sat near the bend where the current was slowest. The building leaned to one side, its roof lines sagging under years of snow. He was a quiet man, wiry and sunburned, who worked without speaking unless something needed fixing. The first night, as we sat by the small stove eating salt pork, he told me only one thing about the place: don't go to the far bank after sundown. When I asked why, he looked at the wall instead of me. Because you might come back, but you won't be yourself. I laughed, thinking it was some rural superstition, but the way his jaw clenched made me stop. The days passed in routine hauling timber, mending tools, listening to the wind in the pines. Yet every so often, I'd catch someone in town glancing toward the far bank with a shadow of something in their eyes. Not fear, exactly. More like recognition, the kind that comes from living with something too long to talk about. It was late October when I made the mistake. We'd been working late, trying to finish a load before the frost set in. By the time I left the mill, the sun was low, a smear of copper behind the ridge. The air was colder than it should have been, and a mist had risen from the water, curling low to the ground. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe the stubbornness of youth, maybe the quiet dare in my uncle's warning. But I stepped off the worn path and crossed the shallow bend toward the far bank. The ground felt strange underfoot, softer than it should be, like stepping on moss-covered boards. The trees on that side grew closer together, their branches heavy with the kind of dark lichen I hadn't seen before. The air smelled faintly metallic, like blood on iron. I followed what I thought was a deer path, but it curved sharply until I found myself in a small clearing. In the center stood the remains of a cabin, just a frame of blackened timbers, the roof long gone. Against one of the charred walls was a table, and on that table, half buried in leaves, lay a glass jar. Inside the jar was what looked like a human finger. It was pale, shriveled, the nail cracked, but unmistakably real. I told myself it was some kind of preserved animal part, maybe a prank left by hunters, but then I noticed the jar wasn't dusty. It was clean, as if someone had placed it there recently. A branch snapped behind me. I turned, but the mist was too thick now to see more. In a few feet, the sound of the creek was gone, replaced by something else. A slow, deliberate tapping, like fingernails on wood. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps again. Every instinct told me to leave, but my legs felt sluggish, as if the ground was pulling at my boots. I forced myself to step back toward the bank, my eyes fixed on the faint outline of the water through the mist. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind the trees, stood a figure, too tall to be my uncle, too still to be a hunter. Its skin, if it was skin, looked the same pale color as the thing in the jar. It didn't move. Not when I stumbled backward, not when I crossed into the shallows. Only when I was halfway across the creek did it turn its head. Slowly, like a hinge that hadn't been used in years. And I swear, even across the distance, I could hear the tapping. I didn't run at first. My boots dragged through the shallows, the cold water soaking my trousers as I tried to keep my eyes forward. But the tapping followed, no louder, no quieter, as though it didn't come from behind me at all, but from inside my own skull. By the time I reached the mill, the light was gone entirely, and my uncle was waiting at the door. His face was pale under the lamplight, his jaw tight. He didn't ask what I'd been doing. He didn't need to. "You crossed," he said simply. I wanted to tell him I hadn't seen anything real, that it was just mist and shadows, but my voice failed. I only nodded. His shoulders sank as though a weight he'd been carrying alone had just been handed to me. That night, I barely slept. The tapping came again, faint through the walls, 3 slow raps, then silence. I lit the lantern twice, finding nothing but the stove and the timber piles in the corner. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was standing just beyond the edge of the light. Waiting. The next day, I tried to bury myself in work. We hauled planks until my hands blistered, and yet every time I glanced toward the far bank, the mist was there, lingering in the branches like smoke. The others in town noticed, to the blacksmith, the innkeeper, the children running barefoot in the mud. Their eyes flickered toward it, then away, as if seeing something they'd been trying to ignore. On the 3rd day, after I crossed, I found something at the mill door. A jar. It was the same size and shape as the one I'd seen in the clearing, but inside wasn't a finger this time. It was an eye. Pale, milky, with a pupil clouded over like dead fish. I dropped it on the spot. The glass didn't break. The lid was rusted shut, yet I could feel heat radiating from inside. My uncle came out, saw it, and without a word, picked it up and carried it to the back shed. He locked the door and pocketed the key. When I asked him what it meant, he said only, "They've marked you." That evening, the tapping returned, louder now, almost impatient. It seemed to move through the walls, following me no matter where I sat. I left the mill house and walked toward town, thinking the noise might fade, but it didn't. It kept perfect pace with my steps, echoing against the ground. The innkeeper, a woman named Marin, pulled me aside when I came in for supper. "You've been to the far bank," she said quietly. Her tone wasn't accusing, it was resigned. When I asked how she knew, she told me about her brother, who'd crossed 15 years earlier. He'd come back quieter, slower to speak, and he'd start tapping his fingers when he thought no one was watching. One morning, she'd woken to find him gone. The only thing left was a jar on the kitchen table. Inside was his own tongue. I wanted to tell her it was impossible, just stories to keep people in line. But then I remembered the eye in the jar, the figure in the mist, the way the ground had seemed to hold me that night. The days blurred. I began waking up with mud on my boots, though I hadn't left my bed. I started hearing my name whispered from the direction of the far bank, always in a voice that sounded almost like my own. On the 7th night, I dreamed, or thought I dreamed, that I was standing in the clearing again. The jar on the table was gone. In its place was a sheet of warped, stained paper. The ink smudged into spirals that drew my eyes until I felt dizzy. The tapping was faster now, urgent, pulling me forward. And just before I reached the paper, I woke to find the shed door open. The jar with the eye was gone. My uncle wouldn't speak. To me that morning, his hands shook as he worked the saw. He kept glancing toward the far bank, and I knew he was counting something in his head. By nightfall, the tapping had moved inside my chest. Not a sound anymore, but a rhythm in my heartbeat. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again. I knew then that it was only a matter of time before I went back. On the 8th day, the river rose. It hadn't rained, but the water climbed the banks as though something beneath was pushing it up from below. The current had a strange pull, swirling against the natural flow, churning with debris that I swore was not wood or weeds. I saw shapes in it, pale, long-fingered shapes that seemed to reach upward before vanishing in the foam. The townsfolk kept their distance. Even the children who usually chased driftwood downstream were nowhere in sight. My uncle barred the mill door and told me we'd not be working until the waters settled, but the way his voice shook told me he didn't expect they would. That night, the tapping stopped. I should have felt relief, but instead the silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that has weight, the kind that presses in on you until you can hear the blood in your ears. I didn't sleep, I just sat by the lamp, watching the walls for movement at some point after midnight. I smelled something damp, earth, and iron, like the scent that lingers in a cellar after a flood. It seeped through the floorboards, curling into the corners of the room. My chest tightened, my vision narrowing until I could see only the door to the shed. It was open again. I don't remember crossing the room, but I remember stepping into it. the shed, and seeing that the shelf where the jar had been was now empty. In its place was that same warped paper from my dream, the spirals drawn so precisely they seemed to twist in on themselves. I reached for it, and the paper was warm, pulsing faintly like it was alive. When I touched it, I heard the tapping again, not in my ears or my chest this time, but in the ground beneath my feet. It was coming from the far bank. I don't know if I made the choice or if the choice was made for me. But the next thing I remember, I was at the river's edge, the water black in the moonlight. The current was still backward, flowing toward the mist instead of away from it. The crossing was easier this time. The water barely reached my knees, and I didn't feel the cold. When I stepped onto the opposite bank, the mist closed around me like a wall. It wasn't empty in there. I saw shapes moving between the trees, tall, thin figures with heads that tilted too far to the side, limbs bending at wrong angles. Their eyes glowed faintly, the way certain stones do under a lantern's light, and they were all tapping on their legs, on the trunks of the trees, against the ground with long nails. The rhythm was the same as in my chest. One of them stepped, closer. Its face wasn't a face, just skin stretched smooth, no mouth, no nose, only those pale, unblinking eyes. In its hands, it held a jar. Inside was something dark, swirling slowly in a liquid that shimmered like oil that offered it to me. When I didn't take it, the tapping grew louder, the other figures closing in. My knees locked, and for a moment I thought I'd never move again. But then something broke inside me, panic or instinct I couldn't tell, and I ran. I don't remember the crossing back. I only remember stumbling onto the mill porch with the jar clutched in my arms. My uncle was waiting. He didn't speak, just took the jar and carried it inside. The next morning, he was gone. The jar was gone, the morning after my uncle vanished. The town was quieter than I had ever known it. No clatter from the smithy, no church bell, no gossip on the porches. Even the dogs kept to the shadows, their ears pinned back. I searched every building, every alley, calling his name until my throat ached. But there was no sign of him, not a footprint in the damp dirt, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. It was as if he had never lived here at all. And yet, people looked at me differently. Not pity, not suspicion, something colder, something like recognition, like they knew exactly where he had gone and why. I saw the same look in every face, from the butcher's wife to the old man who used to whittle on the corner bench by noon. I was the only one in the street. I told myself I should pack my things and leave before. Whatever had taken my uncle decided it wanted me next, but I didn't move. Instead, I stood at the edge of the river, staring at the far bank, at the thin line of mist that hung there even in the heat of midday. It wasn't the same mist as before. This was thinner, more like breath than fog, drifting in slow, deliberate curls. And each curl seemed to reach toward me. That night, the tapping returned, but it wasn't coming from the river this time. It was inside the house. It started in the walls, faint at first, then spreading until it was all around me. I pressed my ear to the floor, and it was under me too, slow, patient, like a message I couldn't quite understand. I tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't open. Neither would the windows. The air grew heavy, thick with that damp, metallic smell, and my head began to pound. The tapping stopped all at once, and in the silence, I heard a different sound, water, trickling softly somewhere inside the house. I followed it to the cellar. The steps were wet, the wood slick under. My boots. By the time I reached the bottom, the water was ankle deep, black and still. In the center of the room was the jar. It was open. I couldn't see what was inside, but I could hear it, a faint, steady rhythm, not unlike a heartbeat. It was perfectly in sync with my own. I should have run. I should have smashed it. But I stepped closer instead, drawn like I had been to the spiral on the paper. The water rippled as I approached, and for a moment I saw my own reflection in it, only it wasn't mine. The face staring back had my eyes, but they glowed faintly, the way the figures had in the mist. The mouth was stretched into something that might have been a smile, but too wide, too sharp. I staggered back, knocking over a shelf. The sound echoed through the cellar, and the heartbeat in the jar quickened. The water began to rise, lapping at my shins, my knees. When it reached my waist, I felt something brush against my leg, long cold fingers curling just enough to let me know they were there. I don't remember climbing the stairs. I don't remember breaking the door. I only remember running into the street and finding it empty. The houses were still there, the lights in the windows still burning, but every door, every window, every porch was deserted. Harlow Creek was gone. The river was the only thing that moved now, its backward current pulling harder than ever toward that wall of mist. And somewhere beyond it, I could hear the tapping again. It was closer. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes, though I was, but because I was certain that if I did sleep, I would wake up in some place that wasn't Harlow Creek and wasn't anywhere I could recognize. The tapping didn't stop. It followed me from the street to the edge of town, from the empty general store to the church steps, always faint at first, like someone testing the walls of my mind, and then louder, closer, as if it knew I could hear it and wanted me to know it was there by morning. The fog from the river had swallowed the far end of Main Street. I stood there for a long time, watching it creep between the buildings, wrap itself around lampposts, and spill across the dirt like a living thing. And then I saw her. She stood just inside the mist, her dress as pale as the fog itself, her hair loose around her shoulders. She wasn't moving, not breathing, not blinking, just staring at me with those faintly glowing eyes I had seen in the water's reflection. I called out, my voice cracking. The sound didn't echo. It didn't even seem to travel beyond the space between us. She didn't answer, but the tapping did. This time it wasn't in the walls or under the floorboards. It was in my chest, a hollow, rhythmic knock behind my ribs. In perfect time with the jar's heartbeat, I stumbled back, my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The tapping was inside me now. The girl stepped forward. The mist moved with her, curling around her ankles, rising to her waist. For a moment I thought she would keep walking until she reached me, but she stopped at the edge of the fog, just shy of where the sun broke through. Her mouth opened. The sound that came out wasn't a voice, wasn't words, it was the river. That same backward current, that sucking pull, but now it was inside my head, rushing through my thoughts, dragging them toward something I couldn't see. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I went. I just needed distance from her, from the mist, from that pull in my mind. My boots pounded the dirt, the air burned in my lungs, but the tapping kept pace, steady and unhurried. Like it knew I couldn't outrun it. I found myself at the old rail yard, the tracks rusted and warped, the station sagging in on itself. No trains had come through in years, not since the floods washed out the bridge to the east. The door to the station office hung open. I stepped inside, meaning to catch my breath, but froze when I saw the desk. It was covered in jars, dozens of them, all the same cloudy glass, all filled with that dark water. Some were sealed, some were open. The open ones pulsed faintly, their contents shifting as if stirred by a slow current, and in every jar, floating just beneath the surface, was an object. A button, a lock of hair, a pocket watch, a bone. I recognized some of them. They belonged to people I had known, people who had vanished. My uncle's silver lighter, Mrs. Hayward's red ribbon, the sheriff's brass badge. I reached for the lighter, but the moment my fingers touched the glass, the water inside swirled violently. A shape pressed against it from the inside, a hand, pale and long-fingered, nails like black splinters. It pushed harder, and the jar rocked on the desk. The tapping grew louder, faster, and for the first time, I understood it. It wasn't a signal, it was a summons. I backed away, my heel catching on the warped floorboards. One of the open jars tipped, spilling its water onto the desk. It didn't soak in, it spread, pooling and creeping toward me like it had a mind of its own. Bolted from the station, not stopping until I was back in the center of town. The fog had reached the square. The girl was gone, but the tapping had never been closer. By midday, the sun had vanished behind a wall of low clouds, the light turning a sickly yellow. I kept moving, circling the town like a trapped animal, searching for some sign of life. But every street was empty, every window dark. The only sound was that tapping. It came from everywhere now. The boards beneath my feet, the hollow walls of the post office, the air itself. It was slower now, almost patient, like it knew I was. Running out of places to go, I remembered the church at the north edge of town. If anywhere still felt safe, maybe it would be there. I cut across the overgrown lot behind the mill, my boots sinking into the soft ground, and followed the narrow, dirt path up the hill. The church doors were closed, but unlocked. Inside, the air was cooler, heavy with dust and the faint scent of mildew. The wooden pews groaned under my weight as I sat down, my heart pounding. I hadn't been inside this place in years, not since Pastor Connolly disappeared during Sunday service. They said he stepped up to the pulpit, opened his Bible, and then simply wasn't there anymore. No flash of light, no sound, just gone. I told myself the rumors weren't true, that it had been a stroke or a heart attack, that the town just liked telling ghost stories to pass the long winters. But standing there now, I wasn't so sure. The altar was bare, the pulpit empty, but behind it, set into the wall, was something I didn't remember, a small wooden door, about the height of my chest, its edges dark with age. It shouldn't have been there. I crossed the room, the tapping growing sharper with every step, until I stood before it. My hand hovered over the latch, hesitating, but something in me, some deep, urgent instinct, told me I had to open it. The hinges screamed as the door swung inward, revealing a narrow stairwell spiraling down into darkness. The smell that drifted up was the same as the water in a jar, metallic, earthy, and wrong. I took one step, then another, the light from the church fading until I was swallowed in black. My hand slid along the rough stone wall, and the tapping echoed off it, louder, faster, vibrating in my bones. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a chamber no bigger than a cellar. The floor was slick with moisture. The air damp and cold. In the center stood a stone basin, filled to the brim with that same black water. But this time, it was moving, a slow, clockwise swirl, pulling down into a center point that seemed impossibly deep. I knelt beside it, peering into the darkness, and for a moment I thought I saw my own reflection staring back. Then it blinked. It wasn't me. The face beneath the water was pale and hollow-cheeked, the eyes to pinpricks of white light. Its lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, and as they did, the tapping became a pounding, each strike rattling the walls. The water began to rise, not splash, not spill, rise, lifting upward, forming a column that reached toward me like an arm. The surface shimmered, the shape of fingers and a palm pressing outward. I stumbled back, but the water followed, stretching thin, droplets breaking away and splattering across the stone. Wherever they landed, they hissed and smoked, leaving black scorch marks. I turned and bolted for the stairs. Behind me, the pounding became deafening, the air trembling with each blow. Something moved in the darkness, dragging itself out of that basin, its weight shaking the ground. I didn't look back. The moment I burst into the church, the light seemed too bright, the air too thin. I slammed the wooden door shut and shoved, a pew against it, my chest heaving. The tapping stopped. For the first time in days, the town was silent, and then the bells began to ring. They hadn't rung in years, not since the last funeral, but now they tolled slow and heavy, each peal echoing across the hills. I stumbled outside, squinting into the strange yellow light, and saw the fog rolling in from every direction. It wasn't creeping anymore, it was rushing. From the east, from the river, from the south, past the mill. From the west, through the rail yard. It poured down the streets like floodwater, filling the gaps between buildings, swallowing the square, and in it, shapes moved, some tall, some bent and broken, some on all fours. They drifted through the fog like shadows, their movements jerky, unnatural, as if they were being pulled by strings. One of them stepped clear of the mist just long enough for me to see its face. It was the girl, but her eyes weren't faint anymore. They burned like coals, bright and unblinking. Her mouth twisted into something that wasn't a smile. and though the sound of the bells swallowed everything else, I swear I heard the river in my head again. Pulling, dragging, calling, calling. I ran. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where I was going. But I knew if I stayed in Harlow Creek one moment longer, I wouldn't be leaving at all. The road out of town was barely visible beneath the fog, its cracked asphalt vanishing into the white. I ran until my lungs burned, the cold air stabbing at my throat, my boots pounding against the ground. Behind me, the bells grew fainter, not because they'd stopped, but because the mist was swallowing the sound, pulling it away like everything else. The further I went, the more wrong the world felt. The trees lining the roadside weren't quite right, their trunks too thin, their branches stretching upward at strange angles, like fingers reaching for something they'd never grasped. Kept my eyes forward, afraid that if I looked too long at them, they might start moving. Half a mile out, the road dipped, and I saw it, the bridge over the Harlow River. Normally the water ran slow here, choked with reeds and debris, but now it surged like a living thing. Waves breaking against the rotting supports, black spray whipping into the air. The fog was thicker over the bridge, so thick I could barely see the first set of railings, but through it I thought I saw figures standing still, waiting. I stopped. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to find another way, but I knew there wasn't one. Every other road was gone, either swallowed by the forest or cut off by the old quarry. If I didn't cross here, I wouldn't get out. I stepped onto the bridge. The wood groaned beneath me, the boards slick with mist. Each step felt like it might be my last before the planks gave way and dropped me into the churning water below. Halfway across, the figures began to move. They didn't walk. They didn't even drift. They simply changed position. One moment on the far side, the next, a few feet closer. Their outlines dissolving and reforming in the fog. One of them stepped close enough for me to see its face. It was my mother, or it looked like her. Her hair hung wet over her shoulders, her skin pale as bone. Her eyes were gone, nothing but smooth, unbroken skin where they should have been. Her mouth opened, and the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was the river again, a low, endless whisper, filling my head with the sound of rushing water. The pull of the current, the cold weight dragging me under. I stumbled back, and my heel caught on a loose board. I fell hard, my palms slapping against the wet wood, splinters digging into my skin. The whisper grew louder. I looked up, and the figures were all around me now, closing in. I don't remember getting up. I just remember running, my feet slipping on the slick boards, my heart hammering. Something cold brushed the back of my neck, and I swear it left a wet handprint on my skin. I burst through the fog on the far side of the bridge, nearly falling to my knees. The road ahead was clear, or at least clearer than the mist behind me. For a moment, I thought I'd made it. Then I saw the sign. It was half buried in the ditch, rusted through in places, but I could still read the words. Welcome to Harlow, CRE. Behind it, the town, the same streets, the same boarded up houses, the same church on the hill. I hadn't escaped. I'd gone in a circle. I stood there, shaking, trying to understand. My mind felt split in two, one part screaming to run, the other frozen in disbelief. Somewhere behind me, the tapping started again. Slow, patient. I turned, and the fog was gone. The bridge was gone. The river was gone. There was only a dirt road stretching into the trees, and at the end of it, the girl Dot. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly to one side, her hair hanging in damp strands over her face. You came back, she said. Her voice was wrong, not a child's voice, not even human. It was layered like several people speaking at once, some fast, some slow, all saying the same words. I didn't mean to, I said, my own voice trembling. She stepped closer. You were always coming back. Her eyes burned brighter now, twin coals in the gloom. She reached into her pocket and pulled something out, a small glass jar filled with that black water. She held it out to me. Drink, she said. The smell hit me immediately, metallic, rotting like wet stone. My stomach turned, but at the same time, a deep, aching thirst rose in my throat. I wanted it. I didn't know why, but I wanted it more than anything. I took a step forward before I caught myself. "No," I whispered. Her face twitched, just for a moment, and then she smiled. "You will," and then she was gone. No sound, no movement. Just gone. I wandered for hours after that. The streets shifted beneath me, buildings changing places, alleys leading somewhere new each time I turned. I passed the same boarded-up shop 3 times, even though I never turned around. By nightfall, I was back in the square. The fountain was running again, though the water was the same dark color as in the jar. Something was moving in it, just below the surface. I didn't stay to see what. Instead, I headed for the only place I hadn't been since this started, the old schoolhouse at the edge of town. The windows were broken, the roof sagging, but the door stood open, swinging gently. In the wind, inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp paper and mold. Desks lay overturned, chalk still clinging to the blackboard in faint, ghostly letters. I wiped some of the dust away and saw words scratched deep into the surface beneath. "It's not the town, it's the water." He didn't understand at first. But as I stared at those words, I realized something. Everything. Every strange thing that had happened. Every disappearance. Every voice. It all came back to the river. The black water. It wasn't just in the river. It was in the ground, in the air, in the people. And it wanted me. The storm finally broke on the 21st night. I was counting the hours since my last sleep, when the first low rumble shook the walls. The clouds rolled in like dark wool, swallowing the moon. By the time the rain began, it wasn't falling so much as pouring sideways, sheets of it driven by a wind that bent the trees like reeds. From my attic window, I could see the river, boiling, churning with a violence I'd never seen before. The backward current had stopped days earlier, but now it was impossible to tell which way it flowed. The whole surface was a chaos of waves and spray, and somewhere beneath it all, the tapping had returned. It was louder than before, not just beneath the ground, but in the walls, in the rafters, in the bones of the house itself. It was in my teeth. Every strike seemed to carry a whisper just below the threshold of hearing, a voice that didn't belong to anything human. I lit every lamp I owned. The shadows stayed around midnight. I saw them again. Figures in the rain, their outlines blurred by the downpour, but still unmistakable. Tall, bent, swaying in time with the wind. They didn't cross the yard this time. They stood at the edge of the property, heads tilted, watching. Their hands moved in strange, deliberate motions, tracing patterns in the air. Spirals, always spirals. One of them stepped forward, just enough for the lamplight to catch its face. It was the same faceless skin I'd seen across the river, smooth and pale as wax. But now I noticed something else, a faint, shifting darkness beneath the surface, like ink swirling in water. The jar, the thing inside it, it was inside them. The wind slammed something against the house, and when I turned back to the window, they were gone. The next day, the storm had stripped the forest bare. Branches littered the yard, the shed roof was half gone, and the river had swollen past its banks. Harlow Creek itself, the little offshoot where the mill drew its water, was gone. Just gone. A channel of mud and stones where it had been for as long as anyone in the valley could remember. The townsfolk were uneasy. Some said it was the worst flood in 50 years. Others whispered it wasn't water that had done it. I didn't speak. I knew the truth was worse than either. That night, I awoke to the sound of someone walking in the attic above me. My house had no attic floor, only beams and insulation. So whoever it was had to be balancing with unnatural care. The steps were slow, deliberate. The tapping began again, perfectly in time with the footsteps. I reached for my lantern, but before I could light it, the sound stopped. The boards above me creaked once, and then the entire ceiling seemed to bow downward, just slightly, as if something heavy was leaning over me. I didn't move until dawn. The following morning, I found muddy footprints leading from my front door to the shed. Not boots, not bare feet either. The impressions were elongated, the toes tapering into narrow points that pierced the earth. Inside the shed, the shelf where the jar had first appeared was empty again. But on the workbench, there was something else, a length of rope, knotted in the middle, soaked through as if it had been dragged from deep water. Tied to it was a fragment of paper. The spiral on it was different this time. Instead of curling inward, it spread outward, each ring breaking into jagged lines, like cracks radiating from shattered glass. When I touched it, I felt cold, not on my skin, but somewhere inside my chest, as if a hand of ice had closed around my heart. The tapping surged in my head until I thought my skull would split. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The rope was gone. The paper, to dot by the 24th night, I'd stopped trying to understand it. I slept in short bursts, ate only when I remembered, and kept every door locked. But the locks didn't matter. Some mornings I'd wake to find the windows open, curtains swaying in a breeze I hadn't felt. Other times, I'd find things in the kitchen moved. The salt jar inverted, the bread knife balanced on its tip. It was on the 25th night that I heard the voice for the first time. It wasn't a word exactly, more like the shape of a word pressed into my thoughts. A heavy, damp syllable that seemed to come from far below the house. It repeated 3 times, each quieter than the last, and then I realized it wasn't getting quieter. It was moving away. I don't know what made me follow it. Maybe I wanted to end it. Maybe I thought I could see what had taken my uncle. Or maybe the spiral had already worked its way far enough into my mind that I didn't have a choice. I'd stepped out into the cold and crossed the yard barefoot. The grass was wet, and in the moonlight I could see the footprints again. Leading toward the river, I followed them. The mist was back, thick and unmoving over the water. I stepped into it, and the world disappeared. No sound but my breathing, no light but the pale shimmer of the river. And then I saw him. My uncle stood on the far bank, his clothes torn, his skin the same pale hue as the figures. His eyes glowed faintly, not with warmth, but with the same sickly light as the jar's contents. He raised a hand, beckoning. I stepped forward. The water closed around my legs, then my waist. It was warm, and something moved against me. Not fish, not plants, but hands. Dozens of them, guiding me forward. When I reached the other side, he turned and walked into the trees. I followed without hesitation. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that swallows sound, that makes you feel as though you're moving deeper into something that doesn't want you to return. We came to a clearing. In the center stood a stone structure, half buried and slick with moss. It wasn't built in any style I recognized. No mortars, no carvings, just massive blocks fitted together with unnatural precision. The air around it was heavy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. My uncle stepped aside, revealing an opening at the base. Inside, the darkness pulsed faintly, and from it came the smell, damp earth, iron, and something sweet, like rotting fruit. I should have turned back, but instead, I stepped inside. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls narrowing until I had to turn sideways to keep moving. The air was hot and wet, clinging to my skin. Far ahead, I could see a faint glow, not fire, but a slow, shifting light, like the contents of the jar magnified 100-fold. When I reached it, I realized it wasn't light at all. It was movement, a vast, coiling shape pressed against the stone, its surface covered in spirals that shifted and spun as I looked at them. The tapping began again, not in my ears, not in the walls, but in my bones. I understood then that the jar, the spirals, the figures, they were all just pieces of it, fragments sent out into the world to prepare the way. And now that I had followed them here, I knew I wasn't leaving, not as myself. The creek had been speaking to me for weeks now, not in a way I could explain to anyone else. No, that would make it sound like madness. And maybe it was, but in a rhythm I could feel in my bones. It started with the hum, always the hum. At first, I thought it was coming from beneath the floorboards of my uncle's house. But now, in the gray light of each dawn, I could feel it everywhere, in the walls, in the ground beneath my boots, in the space between my ribs. The sound had settled inside me, a steady, patient vibration, like something waiting for the right moment to break through. The townsfolk stayed away from the creek. I didn't blame them. The water had gone bad weeks before I returned. Animals stopped drinking from it. The few people who tried out of habit, or because they didn't believe the rumors, developed strange ailments. Teeth loosening and their gums, hair turning brittle and falling out in clumps, eyes clouding over with a faint, milky film. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know it wasn't the water itself. The creek was only the doorway. I learned that the night I followed the hum to its source, it was close to midnight, and I couldn't sleep. The boards under my cot felt like they were pulsing, rising and falling with each slow wave of sound. I told myself I wouldn't look, told myself I'd just close my eyes and wait until morning, but my hand was already reaching for the lantern. I stepped outside into the cool night air, and the hum deepened. It was stronger than I'd ever felt. It thrumming through my feet, my legs, straight into my chest. I walked toward the creek without meaning to, my body moving like it remembered a route I'd never taken. The moon was high, the water black and still. No wind moved the trees. Then, in the exact center of the creek, I saw the ripple. Just one. But it spread too slowly, as though the water itself was thicker than it should be. The hum sharpened into something almost like a melody, a sequence of low, drawn-out notes that seemed to form a pattern. My head tilted before I realized I was mirroring the cadence, swaying ever so slightly, like a child to a lullaby. I took off my boots and stepped into the water. The cold was instant, biting, but the deeper I went, the less I felt it. By the time the water reached my waist, I wasn't cold at all. In fact, I couldn't feel the creek on my skin anymore. It was like walking through air that happened to be heavy enough to press against me. Halfway across, my foot touched something. Solid dot. It wasn't the rocky bottom. It was smooth, and it gave under my weight almost like muscle. I froze, staring down. The water here wasn't reflecting the moonlight anymore. It was just black, as if the surface had been cut away entirely, and I was staring into an opening. The hum stopped. The silence was worse. I turned to head back, but my foot caught on something, and I fell forward. My face went under, and for a moment I thought I'd come up choking. But the black wasn't water anymore. It was open space, and I was falling through it. When I landed, I was in a tunnel. The air was wet and close, smelling faintly of iron and rot. The walls weren't rock or soil. They pulsed faintly, contracting and releasing like the sides of a throat. The hum started again. Only now, it was all around me. Louder, so loud I could feel my teeth ache from it. It wasn't a single voice. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, all overlapping, resonating in some impossible harmony. I walked because there was nowhere else to go. The tunnel sloped gently downward, and as I moved, the air grew warmer, thicker. Shapes moved in the walls. Sometimes I saw fingers, sometimes faces, pale and distorted, as though pressed up against a layer of glass just beneath the surface. Their mouths opened and closed in sync with the hum. Eventually, I reached a chamber. It was massive, far, larger than anything that could fit beneath the creek or the town. The ceiling arched high overhead, disappearing into darkness. The floor was covered in shallow black water that rippled without any wind or movement to disturb it. In the center stood a structure. It looked like a pillar at first, but as I approached, I realized it was made of human forms, hundreds of them, fused together at odd angles. Their skin stretched and interwoven until you couldn't tell where one body ended and another began. Their faces were tilted upward, eyes closed, mouths open in the same endless hum. I should have run. I should have turned and clawed my way back through the tunnel, through the water, into the cold air above. Instead, I stepped into the shallow black water, moving toward the pillar. Something about it felt inevitable. When I was close enough, one of the faces opened its eyes. They weren't human eyes. They were deep and black, like the reflection I'd seen in the creek weeks before. It stopped humming, and so did every other mouth in the chamber. The silence was absolute, crushing. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then, in a voice that didn't belong to any single mouth, but came from all of them at once, it spoke a single word: stay. I don't know how long I was there after that. Time doesn't work the same in that place. I remember the water rising, covering my ankles, then my knees, then my chest, until I was floating in it, except I wasn't breathing, and I wasn't drowning either. I remember shapes moving beneath me, brushing against my legs, my back, my face, and I remember the feeling deep in my gut that I hadn't been taken somewhere new. I had been brought back to where I'd always belonged. When I awoke, I was on the bank of the creek. The sun was just rising, burning off the last of the mist. My boots were neatly placed beside me, dry as if they'd never touched the water. The hum was gone, but when I stood and looked at the reflection in the water, it wasn't gone from me. The eyes looking back weren't mine anymore. The days no longer felt separate. I stopped marking them. After I first descended into that narrow shaft beneath the old grain mill, time warped twisting into something less like a line and more like a knot. The lantern's light seemed weaker each time I struck it, as if the flame knew where it was and feared the dark around it. The tunnel walls here were not stone. They were the soft, packed silt of the creek bed, slick with moisture and riddled with tiny holes, like something had burrowed through long ago. When I put my ear to the earth, I swore I could hear movement, dry scraping one moment, the faint shuffle of limbs the next. There was a smell down there, too thick, metallic, but not quite blood. It was sharper, like the air in a mine right before you hear the first splinter of wood. A warning, but one you couldn't carry back to the surface. I crawled forward, boots dragging. My shoulders brushed the walls. The silt gave way in some spots, collapsing slightly under my weight. It felt wrong, like I wasn't the first to make this passage. No, someone, or something, had worn this path smooth over decades. The sound of water returned, not the steady rush of the creek above, but a sluggish, heavy trickle. I followed it until the tunnel opened into a low chamber. My lantern caught a glint, hundreds of tiny reflective specks in the walls. I thought they were mica or quartz until I got closer. They were teeth, human teeth, pressed into the silt like they'd been spat out and forced into the wall by hand. Some still had roots clinging to them. Others were cracked or broken. The water pooled at the far side of the chamber, where it dripped from a fissure in the ceiling. The pool was black, so black it didn't even ripple when drops hit its surface. I shone my lantern over it and saw something staring back, not my reflection. Its face was pale and narrow, with no hair, no eyebrows. The skin was stretched too tight over bone. The eyes were wrong set too far apart, with a wet, milky film. The mouth didn't move, but I heard words in my head, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well that had said my name. The lantern sputtered, the flame dancing erratically. I backed away, but the water in the pool swelled, as if something enormous shifted beneath it. Then, with a sound like a soaked canvas being torn, a hand rose out of the black dot. It was long, too long. The fingers were jointed strangely, bending. At points, human bones shouldn't. They dripped that same black liquid, but when it hit the ground, it sizzled. I turned and scrambled back into the tunnel, the lantern swinging wildly. Behind me, I could hear it pulling itself free, its limbs dragging against the walls, the sound of wet fabric tearing again and again. The tunnel felt smaller now, like the earth was closing in, urging me to stay, to be part of it. My breath came in short bursts, each one tasting more of silt and rot. When I reached the shaft to the surface, I nearly sobbed. But as I set the lantern down and grabbed the rope, I saw something carved into the shaft's wooden support beams. Not initials, not dates, not names, not dozens of them. The first was dated 1821. The last had no date, but the wood beneath it was still pale, freshly cut. It was my name. The rope jerked in my hands before I could react. Something had grabbed it from below, pulling with such force that the hemp burned my palms. I let go and stumbled back, just as the rope went taut, then slack again. A moment later, I heard the faintest splash from deep in the dark. I don't remember climbing out. My memory skips like a cracked phonograph. One moment I was in the shaft, the next I was above ground, coughing in the daylight, the old mill sagging behind me. I didn't go home. I didn't go back to the others. I walked upriver instead, into the denser woods, where the creek narrowed into a dark, twisting ribbon. The humming had started again, not loud, but enough to make the leaves tremble on their stems. I kept walking until my legs gave out, collapsing near an uprooted tree. The hollow beneath its roots was wide enough to crawl into, and I did, curling myself against the damp earth like an animal hiding from a storm. That night, I dreamed of the pool again, except I wasn't standing at its edge. I was beneath it. The water pressed in from all sides, but I could breathe. The walls of the pool weren't dirt or stone, they were ribs, and the teeth from the chamber wall drifted past me in the dark, still white, still grinning. When I awoke, my clothes were wet. The roots above me were tapping against each other in the wind. Only there was no wind by the third night in the woods. I began to realize something that chilled me more than anything I had seen beneath the Millie was not walking away from it anymore. Every step, every change in direction, somehow pulled me back toward the creek. No matter how far I went, I would hear it again, its slow-moving water. The strange, measured hum that lived under the sound of flowing current. I kept the lantern close, though the flame was burning low. I had enough oil for perhaps another few hours of light, but I was afraid to use it sparingly. In the dark, the sound change became sharper, almost like whispered words I couldn't fully catch. The woods here were denser than any part of Harlow Creek I'd ever known. The trees leaned toward one another, branches tangling high above, shutting out the moon. I kept my head low, avoiding the low-hanging limbs that seemed to bend closer each time I passed under them. That night, I stumbled across something I thought at first was a hunter's camp. A small ring of stones sat in a leaf litter, with black ash still clinging to the center. Next to it, a square of ground had been cleared of leaves, revealing pale earth beneath. I crouched, and my stomach clenched. It wasn't pale earth. It was bone, a ribcage human lying flat, as if whoever it belonged to had been pressed into the ground rather than buried beneath it. The ribs were fused together by some hard, glossy substance, like tree resin. Something had been making this. I felt the hum in my teeth now. It wasn't from the creek. It was coming from the ribcage. I stepped back quickly, but the leaf litter around me shifted as if something was crawling beneath it. Long lines appeared in the soil, radiating outward from the ribcage. I did not wait to see what would happen. I ran. The forest seemed to rearrange itself around me. Every path I took curved until I saw the water again its surface, black in the absence of moonlight. The hum was louder here. My lantern flickered and dimmed. I thought of dousing the flame to save the oil, but a rustling across the water made me keep it lit. Shapes were moving in the tree line opposite me. At first, I thought they were people. They stood upright, thin, their outlines faintly human, but their limbs were too long, their heads tilted too far forward. One step closer to the bank, and the light caught its skin wet, pale, almost translucent. The eyes were small, deep in the skull, and they did not blink. It knelt by the water, dipping a hand into the creek. The black liquid dripped from its fingers, though the creek itself ran clear. It lifted its head then, and even across the distance. I knew it had seen me. They all had. I turned, pushing through the undergrowth, my clothes snagging on branches. The hum rose to a drone now, vibrating the air, making my vision blur. At the edges, I could hear movement behind me, but it was slow, deliberate, as if they knew I could not run far. When I found the cabin, I thought for a moment I had been saved. It was small, half-frosted, the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the smell hit me first, sweet, sickly stench of decay. I lifted the lantern and saw the walls. They were covered in paper hundreds of sheets, each pinned with crude nails. Drawings all of the same thing. The pool beneath the mill, over and over, from different angles, with different shapes rising from its depths. Some drawings showed only the surface, others the pale, long-limbed things crawling out. A few were just a pair of eyes, staring up from the black. On the floor was a cot, the blankets matted with filth. Beside it sat a wooden crate. Inside, I found rows of glass jars filled with dark water, each one sealed with wax. Something floated in each jars, maul white and sharp teeth. My teeth ached just looking at them. I didn't stay long. The hum was inside the cabin now, shaking the nails. In the boards, I grabbed one of the jars without thinking why. I don't know, and stumbled out into the night. The shapes were closer now. They did not hurry. They simply followed, their heads cocked, watching. The jar in my hand grew warm. My palms sweated. Against the glass, the teeth inside rattled faintly, as though something in the dark water was moving. I thought about smashing it, but a voice in my head whispered, "Don't." The forest opened up without warning, and I found myself standing at the old bridge on the north side of the creek. Its boards were slick, rotting. Half of it had collapsed into the water long ago. Across the gap, I could see lantern light. Faint, swaying, a person stood, holding its small light, perhaps a woman. She wore a long dress, and her hair was pinned back. "Help me," I called, my voice hoarse. She did not answer. She only raised her free hand and pointed at the jar I carried. Then, slowly, she shook her head. The hum surged, and the boards beneath my feet shuddered. I looked down. Hands were rising from the water. Too many to count. All pale, all long-fingered. Reaching between the boards for my boots, the woman on the far bank turned and walked away, her lantern bobbing into the dark. I tried to follow, but the bridge gave way beneath me. I plunged into the creek. The water was freezing, but not in a way I could feel on my skin. It sank straight into my bones, locking my muscles. The jar slipped from my grip, sinking. I saw pale shapes moving beneath me, fingers, faces, ribs, teeth rising through the black. Something wrapped around my ankle and pulled. My lungs burned. My vision narrowed. I thought of the shaft beneath the mill, of my name carved fresh into the wood. Then, somehow, I was on the bank, alone. The jar was gone. The hum had stopped, but the water still moved, slow and heavy, and I could see my reflection in it. It did not blink when I did. The night had grown so still that it felt unnatural, as though the air itself had stopped breathing. Even the insects, usually a constant chorus in these woods, had fallen silent. I sat in the chair by the window, my body heavy from exhaustion, but my mind sharper than it had ever been. Sleep would not come. I didn't want it to. Sleep meant letting go, and I knew without knowing how that something waited for me the moment my eyes closed. The house seemed different now, not just older or emptier, but wrong. The walls had a lean to them that I had not noticed before, as if the whole structure was bending inward, bowing toward me. The boards creaked softly under a weight I couldn't see, and the smell of damp earth rose from the floor, stronger with each passing hour. I had been hearing it since sundown, the tapping. At first faint, like rain on a far roof, but now deliberate, measured. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps again. Always from below, somewhere under the floorboards, somewhere I could not reach. I had checked the cellar hours ago and found it empty, the air thick with dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. Yet the sound persisted. I tried to distract myself by watching the tree line beyond the yard. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, but I could still make out the black shapes of the pines. They seemed taller tonight, their tips swaying without wind. I told myself it was just the shadows, just my mind turning tricks on me after too many sleepless nights. But each time I blinked, they seemed a little closer. At some point, the tapping stopped. Relief washed over me for a brief second, until I realized that in its absence, I could hear something else, something wet moving in the dark beneath the floor. It was the sound of something dragging itself forward, slow and patient. The boards under my feet flexed slightly. I leaned forward, listening. My breath caught in my throat. The dragging stopped. Then, without warning, a single knock echoed from directly beneath my chair. I froze, my hands gripping the armrest so tightly my knuckles ached. Another knock followed, then a third, and then silence again. I stood up, my legs weak, and moved to the center of the room. That was when the smell hit me stronger than before, a sour, rotting scent that rose in waves. It was coming from the cracks between the boards. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. A thin line of black water began seeping up through one of the cracks, spreading slowly across the floor. It was thick, almost syrup-like, and it glistened faintly in the dim light. I backed away, but the water followed, snaking toward me as though it had intent. I stumbled into the hallway, my boots slipping on the warped wood. The air was colder. Here, the walls damp to the touch. I could hear something moving above me now, in the attic light steps, then heavier ones, then a sound like fingernails scraping along the rafters. Every instinct told me to leave the house, but when I reached the front door, I found it stuck. Not locked, just stuck, as though the wood had swollen with moisture. I pulled harder, but the frame groaned in protest. Then I heard it breathing, not mine. From just beyond the door, slow, wet breaths. I stepped back, heart hammering. The breathing stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse. My eyes drifted upward, and I saw the faint outline of something pressed against the frosted glass of the door's upper panel. It was pale, almost featureless, but I could make out the curve of a forehead, the suggestion of eyes. I didn't wait to see more. I ran for the back door, but the kitchen was darker than it should have been. The lantern I had left on the counter was gone, and the moonlight through the window seemed swallowed by the air itself. My hand brushed against the doorknob and found it slick, as though coated in that same black water from the floor. The dragging sound returned, now from all around me, beneath the floor, above the ceiling, inside the walls. It was everywhere, closing in. I stumbled back toward the center of the house, unsure where else to go, and that was when I noticed the sound had changed. It wasn't dragging anymore, it was crawling faster. The boards under my feet began to bulge upward in places, as though something beneath was pushing against them. I backed into the parlor, my eyes fixed on the largest bulge. The wood splintered slightly, and through the gap, I saw a pale skin, it pulsed. I don't remember screaming, but my throat burned as if I had. I turned to run, but my legs carried me, not toward the door, but toward the stairs. I didn't want to go up there, but my body seemed to move without my permission. The steps groaned under my weight, and I could hear the crawling below grow more frantic. Following me, the upstairs hallway was narrow, the air so thick with dampness, it felt like walking through fog. The wallpaper here was peeling, revealing dark stains underneath. The smell was worse than ever, sharp, metallic, like wet rust. I reached the last room at the end of the hall and shoved the door open. It was empty, except for a single chair in the center. On the seat lay something small, wrapped in cloth. My hand shook as I reached for it, and the fabric gave way to reveal a jar. Inside was murky liquid, and floating in eye to eye. Just one it moved. The jar slipped from my hands and shattered on the floor. The liquid spread, and the eye rolled free, coming to rest at my feet. It stared up at me, and then slowly blinked at. That was when the sound from below stopped altogether. The house was silent. I wanted to believe that meant it was over. It wasn't. The silence was only the breath before the scream. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It wasn't the steady, cleansing sort of rain that washes the dirt from a place. It was heavier, warmer, and it smelled faintly of rust, as though the clouds were wringing themselves out over some hidden wound in the sky. By the 3rd day, the creek had swallowed its banks. The road out of town was a slick ribbon of mud. I watched from the upstairs window as the water licked at the porch steps, carrying with it leaves, twigs, and the occasional dead fish that spun lazily in the current before being swept away. Every few minutes, there was a faint knocking beneath the floorboards. Not frantic, not urgent, just testing. I knew what it meant now. It wasn't trying to scare me anymore. It was letting me know it could wait. Sleep had abandoned me long ago. I sat in the rocking chair by the window, my uncle's rifle across my knees, though I wasn't. Sure, if bullets would matter, the nights had become the worst. That was when the lantern flame would falter, when the sound of the rain was drowned out by something else, a low, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat, echoing from under the house, and then there was the voice. It didn't speak in words at first, just a vibration that crawled into the back of my skull, the way a migraine announces itself before the pain arrives. I'd feel it in my teeth, in my bones. Then, on the 2nd night of rain, it shaped itself into something human enough to understand. You've been here long enough. I didn't answer. I didn't move. The pulse in the floorboards grew louder. I could see the surface of the rainwater in the yard trembling, the ripples spreading outward in perfect circles, even though nothing had touched it. That's when I realized it wasn't the rain that had flooded the town, it was the creek. Rising of its own will, by morning, the water was halfway up the front door. I had no choice but to retreat to the attic, bringing the rifle, a lantern, and the few dry biscuits I had left. The air up there was stifling, thick with the smell of mildew and dust. I pushed a small chest against the window and sat on it, looking down at what had once been Harlow Creek Road. The rooftops of the nearest houses jutted up like tombstones from the water. From the direction of the mill, I saw movement, not the natural kind, like a log drifting by. This was deliberate, something pale, just beneath the surface. Gliding smoothly against the current dot, it was heading straight for my house. I backed away from the window, my breath catching in my throat. The pulse began again, this time traveling up through the walls, the very beams of the attic vibrating with it. Not much longer, the voice said. I tried to block it out, tried to think of anything else, the smell of my mother's bread, the sound of boots on dry earth, but the attic grew colder, the air sharp as glass in my lungs. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard the sound. Scraping, slow, deliberate, something clawing its way up the side of the house. I raised the rifle, pointed it at the window. My hands were shaking so badly the barrel rattled against the glass. The scraping stopped just below the sill dot, and then a hand, pale, waterlogged, with skin that seemed too thin to contain what was inside, gripped the frame from the outside. Wasn't pulling itself in, not yet, just holding there, as if to let me know it could. Night fell again. I lit the lantern and kept it close, though the flame seemed weaker than usual, like it too was afraid. I forced myself to keep watch, because I knew if I closed my eyes, I wouldn't open them again. But exhaustion is a kind of predator. It waits until you can't keep your head up anymore, until your mind starts wandering where it shouldn't. I must have drifted because when I opened my eyes, the lantern was out. The attic was black, so dark I couldn't see the window anymore. And then I heard it, a drip, slow, steady, from above me. But there was no leak in the roof. I'd checked. The drip landed on my shoulder, warm, too warm. I looked up. Something was crouched in the beams above, its limbs bent wrong, its face, not its own. It was wearing mine. The smile stretched wide, the eyes glistening black in the lanternless dark. Not much longer, it whispered again, but this time the voice was exactly like mine by the time the storm broke. The water had receded almost as quickly as it had risen. The roads were passable, the creek back within its banks. The sun shone on a town that should have been relieved. But they didn't find anyone in my uncle's house. They found the rifle, the lantern, and a trail of wet footprints leading from the attic to the front porch, and then into the creek dot. And if you stand there, on certain nights, when the rain has just stopped and the water is high, you might see someone in the attic window, rocking slowly in the chair, smiling at you. Through your own face, they told me the water was only chest high when they found me. That's what they said, chest high, as though the measurement somehow explained why. I wasn't breathing when they pulled me out. I remember none of that. I don't remember the hands grabbing me, or the shouting, or the taste of rainwater and silt choking my throat. I remember something else entirely. The silence, it wasn't the silence of being underwater, when sound becomes a muffled hum. No, this was deeper, complete. A kind of silence that made you aware of your own thoughts in ways you shouldn't be. I could hear the muscles in my jaw moving when I swallowed. I could hear my heartbeat as though it were coming from somewhere else, and in that silence, there was a figure. It wasn't swimming, it wasn't walking, it was simply there. The water didn't move around it, didn't ripple against it. Its shape was human enough, but its edges wavered, like heat rising from a road. I don't know how long we stared at each other before it moved closer, not swimming, but arriving until its face was inches from mine. That's when I realized it wasn't wearing my face anymore. It was wearing my uncle's. When I woke, I was in a bed I didn't recognize. The air smelled of vinegar and boiled linen. The window beside me was cracked open, letting in the heavy scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. A woman in a dark dress and apron was sitting in a chair, sewing. Her eyes flicked to mine as soon as I moved. "You're awake," she said, setting her work down. "That's good. Where am I?" My voice was thin, like I'd been shouting for hours. She told me I was in the back room of the old parsonage, that I'd been found at the edge of the creek 2 days ago, that I should rest. I tried to sit up, but my chest burned. "My uncle," I said. "Where is he?" The woman's sewing needle paused in midair. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "There's no one else," she said softly. "You were alone." I wanted to argue, but my throat was dry and my head was swimming. Over the next 2 days, the woman, she told me her name was Mrs. Baines, kept me in that bed. She brought me broth and boiled potatoes, and sometimes she'd sit and read from the Bible in a voice that was calm but not kind. The strangest part was the window. It looked out over the creek. I couldn't see the water directly, only the tops of the trees that lined the bank, but I could hear it. The sound was wrong now, not the gentle rush I'd known since childhood, but a low, ceaseless gurgle, like something breathing just beneath the surface. Then every time I looked out, there was something different about the trees. One day a branch would be broken, hanging low over the bank. The next, it would be gone entirely, as though the tree had been pulled under. Once, I thought I saw the pale glint of a hand gripping the bark before slipping away. I told Mrs. Baines about it. She stopped reading, slowly closed the book. "You didn't hear anything," she said, "and you didn't see anything. Understand?" The voice was not calm now. It was hard. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my door. Slow, barefoot, I sat up, holding my breath. The footsteps passed the door, then paused by the window. I heard the creak of the old wood frame, as though someone were leaning against it from outside, and then the voice mine again. Not much longer. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. On the 5th morning, Mrs. Baines told me I was well enough to leave. She gave me a loaf of bread, a thin coat, and a warning. "Go west. Don't take the road by the creek." When I asked why, she looked past me toward the window, her jaw tightening. "Because you won't make it out that way." I should have listened. By midday, the road forked. The left path led into the hills, the right dipped toward the water. I told myself I only wanted to see it once more before I left, to prove it was still just a creek, nothing more. The trees thickened as I walked. The air grew damp, and the sound of the water swelled. When I reached the bank, the sun was hidden. Behind thick clouds, the water looked calm, too calm. Then I saw it, a figure, standing knee-deep in the center of the creek, perfectly still. It was me. The clothes were wrong, too old, too worn, but the face was mine, down to the scar on my chin from when I fell off the fence at 7. It raised its hand slowly, palm out, not a wave, a beckon. The ground beneath, my feet softened. I looked down. The bank was mud, sucking at my boots. I stepped back, but the mud clung harder, pulling me down an inch, then 2. When I looked up again, the figure was closer. The water around it did not move. The voice came from behind me. "You shouldn't have come back." I turned and saw Mrs. Baines, standing in the trees. Only, not her. Her skin was too pale, her eyes too dark, and her smile too wide. The last thing I remember, before the world tilted sideways, was her stepping into the water without making a ripple. When I woke again, I was lying in the middle of the road west of town. My coat was gone. My bread was gone. The sky was the wrong color, too bright, too sharp, and the air smelled of wet stone. The creek was nowhere in sight, but I could still hear. It was louder now, closer, and it was inside me. I had sworn never to go back. For 23 years, that oath held, and all that time I didn't set foot in the county. I avoided maps, old friends, and the scent of pine after rain, because it reminded me too much of the trees that leaned over that path. I built a life as far from water as I could manage. Dry ground, dry air, dry hands. But dry dreams? No. The dreams stayed wet. At first, they came once a month, then once a week, and then, without warning, every night. I would wake to find the bed sheets damp, not from sweat, but from creek water, cold and smelling of silt. I could feel it dripping down my arms, see the faint prints of pale fingers pressed into the fabric. I told myself it wasn't real, but I had told myself that before. The final push came in the form of a letter. No return address. Just my name scrawled across the front in that uneven, scratchy hand I had seen once before, in the ledger at the mill, beside the list of the disappeared. Inside was a scrap of paper, yellowed and curling at the edges. It read, "They still hum for you." I should have burned it. I didn't. The road to Harlow Creek hadn't changed. The stones were still loose in the same spots. The grass still thin and brittle from where wagon wheels had worn it down decades earlier. I knew each bend, each shadow, even though the trees had grown taller, thicker. They seemed to be leaning closer than they had in my youth, as if listening. By the time I reached the first bend, where the water became visible, my mouth was dry. I could hear it before I could see it. The low, constant hum, exactly as I remembered, though it seemed louder now, more insistent, as if it had been waiting for me. I thought I might find the place empty, abandoned. I was wrong. There were signs of life, fresh wagon tracks, a newly cut path to the bank, and footprints too large to belong to any child, too small to belong to any grown man I had ever known. The edges of each print were damp, the soil darker where the weight had pressed in. At the water's edge, I saw the mill, or what was left of it. The roof had collapsed in two places, and the wheel no longer turned. But the foundation was sound, the door still hanging on its hinges. I pushed it open and was greeted by the same smell I had carried in my memory all these years. Wet earth, rotting wood, and something faintly metallic. The ledger was gone. In its place, on the same table, sat a single jar. The glass was clouded, the lid rusted. Inside was not a finger nor an ear. This time it was a tooth, a human molar. I didn't hear the footsteps. I only felt the shift in the air behind me, the cold, damp draft of someone or something stepping. Closer I turned, but the space was empty. The shadows in the corners trembled slightly, as if stirred by breath. The hum grew louder. It was no longer coming from outside. It was in the walls, in the floor, in my own chest. I stumbled out of the mill, but the bank had changed. The creek was wider, darker, the current stronger, and standing in the shallows, knee-deep in black water, was a figure. They wore no face, not in the way you might think, not obscured, not hidden, but truly absent. Where the face should have been was only smooth, pale skin. But when they tilted their head toward me, I knew they were looking. They raised one hand and tapped the surface of the water. Once, twice, 3 times. The hum stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard the voices. Not one, not 2, but dozens, maybe hundreds, whispering from beneath the surface. My name, over and over, in tones I recognized and some I didn't. The missing, I wanted to run. My legs didn't move. The figure stepped forward, and the water didn't ripple. Another step, and another, until they were standing on the bank before me. They smelled of the same silt and decay I had woken to in my sheets for years. They took my wrist. Their fingers were cold, wet, and impossibly strong. The grip tightened until I felt my bones shift. Then they pulled me toward the water. You might think I fought, screamed, struggled. I didn't. There was no point. The hum had returned, not from outside, but inside my own head, drowning out thought, drowning out fear. The water closed over my boots, my knees, my waist. It was colder than I remembered. It clung to my skin like a living thing, and beneath its surface, shapes moved, pale hands reaching, brushing against me, pulling me deeper. I saw faces then, not the faceless figures, but the faces of those I had known. My uncle, the storekeeper, a boy I'd gone to school with. All of them pale, all of them smiling in that wrong way, all of them mouthing the same word without sound. Stay. The last thing I saw before the water closed over my head was the bank empty, silent, as if nothing had happened. You might ask how I can tell you this if I drowned that day. The truth is, I don't know. I woke in my own bed, miles from the creek, clothes dry, skin warm. But the sheets were wet again, and every night since, when I close my eyes, I'm back there, standing in the shallows, waiting for someone else to return. Because now, I understand the hum. It isn't calling me anymore. It's calling through me. If you ever find yourself near Harlow Creek and you hear that low, steady sound beneath the rush of water, turn back, do not follow it. Do not look for the mill. And above all, do not answer when it calls your name, because some places do not want you to visit. They want you to stay.